into the chat. We can repaste those in the chat, and we'll call on you at the end, so you guys have time to think. Julia.
My name is Julia. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Baltimore on Piscataway land. And the first word that comes into my mind is patriarchy.
And Penelope.
Yeah, sorry, I'll turn my camera on in a sec, but I'm Penelope. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Brooklyn or Canarsie land. And wait, should I put it into the word cloud or say it?
Yeah, you can go ahead and put it into the word cloud. And then at the end, hopefully we'll show everyone's words together.
Okay, cool.
Yona.
Hi, I'm Yona. I use he, him pronouns. I am from Falls Village, Connecticut. I'm on Mohican land.
Ruby.
I'm Ruby. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently in Ohio on Erin Kaskowski land. Am I passing it to someone else?
No, we're just calling on folks. Abigail.
Hi, my name's Abby. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Tenafly, New Jersey, and I'm currently trying to find what land I'm from because my Zoom wasn't working, so I don't have the link, but I'll be happy to share. Can you just send the link, please? Thank you.
Ella.
Hi, my name is Ella. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Sacramento, California, which is Miwok-Nissenin land.
Tali.
Hi, I'm Tali, she, her. I'm currently in Michigan on Anishinaabe land. And oh, that's it, sorry.
Shane.
I'm Shane. I use he, him pronouns. I live in Livingston, New Jersey on Munsee Lenape land.
Sophie.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is on Potawatomi land.
Eliana.
Hi, I'm Eliana. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from Chicago, also on Potawatomi land.
Tova.
Hi, I'm Tova. Sorry, my camera's off. I'm also eating dinner. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm also on Potawatomi land.
Bella.
I thought I went already, but I'm.
Oh, I said Bella. I'm sorry, Ella.
Oh, I thought you said Ella. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Bella, she, her. And I'm from Berkeley, California, which is Ohlone land. And has Julia gone?
Yeah, she has. Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm in Tenafly, New Jersey on Munsee Lenape land.
Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in Montreal, which is Mohawk land.
Madeline.
I'm Madeline, I use she, her pronouns, and I am on Narragansett land.
And then Asher and Sophie, we're just doing some intros, and we can repaste those in the chat. But it's just name, pronouns, and then the Indigenous land you're on, and then there's also a Mentimeter to put in what you think of when you think of the environment and feminism.
Hi guys, I'm Sophie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Los Angeles, and that is Chumash land.
And Asher, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Hi guys. Sorry I'm late. This is my 5th meeting of the day, so I'm a little tired. But my name's Asha. I use he, him pronouns. I live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm on Seminole and Tequesta land, and I'm just reading through the chat to see this. And when I think of Well, when I think of the intersection of climate activism and feminism, well, when I think in terms of climate change, we know that women are affected a lot more by men just when you look at the stats alone. So that's really what I think about the most.
Thanks, Asher. I'm Lucy. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from right outside of Boston on Massachusetts land.
Okay, thank you all for sharing. We're gonna get started. Madeline, if you don't mind sharing your screen. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so has anyone ever heard, you can go to the third slide, please. The fourth slide, I guess. I lied. Has anyone ever heard of the term ecofeminism before? You can raise your hand if you have. Yeah. Does anyone want to define it for me? You can just unmute because I can't see your faces. Okay, that's fine. Oh, Shane. Yeah.
Yeah, this may be wrong, but my understanding of it is either that it like seeks to almost use like feminist like ways of thinking about issues in order to like interpret and visualize environmental issues, and or also movements that seek to empower women in a sustainable way, and like using their connection with nature and with agriculture in order to help empower women economically.
Yeah, that is a very brilliant answer. Thank you. What about the term eco-womanism? Has anybody heard that before? A few. Does anybody want to define what that is? And again, there's no right or wrong answer.
I believe that womanism is like specifically a form of feminism that's like led and by like Black women, and it's more like around Black women's goals, but I could be wrong.
You are completely right. And Madeline, you can go 2 slides, please. So ecofeminism is a philosophical and political term that addresses the intersections between climate change and sexism, but it just leaves it at that. It's historically ignored the intersections between climate change, sexism, and racism, despite the indivisible nature of the three. Therefore, eco-womanism was created. So eco-womanism separates itself from ecofeminism because it takes into account African and Indigenous lives, just like Penelope was saying, when ecofeminism has historically excluded them. So the term was popularized by Melanie Harris, who wrote the book Eco-Womanism, African American Women and Earth Honoring Faiths. And also in that book, you can go to the next slide, please. She mentions Kimberly and Ruffin's idea of the environmental beauty burden paradox. Before we get into that, does anybody know what a paradox is? / wants to define it for us. That is okay. You can go to the next slide, Madeline. So a paradox, as defined by Oxford Languages, is a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that, when investigated or explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. That's a lot of words. So essentially, it's a contradiction. So can anyone think of an example of a paradox that they know of?
I actually encountered this recently reading in a history book. I can't remember the names, but historically there was one politician who was extremely intent that he was against ending slavery, and yet before the end of his life, he released all of his slaves. And then turned to another person who wanted to end slavery and yet kept hundreds of slaves and never released them. So that was one I encountered recently.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Thank you. This is alive. Penelope in the chat. Yeah, these are all great examples. Thank you so much. And you can keep writing them in the chat if you think of any more as we keep going. So one paradox that is very important to what we're going to talk about today is the climate paradox. And has anyone heard of that before? You can just raise your hand. Maybe not, that's okay. So the climate paradox is the fact that people don't want to address the climate and the fact that it's drastically deteriorating, and therefore they ignore it because it scares them. And a quote from Rethinking Climate Communications and the Psychological Climate Paradox is, cognitive dissonance, which is when people's mind doesn't agree with what they do and it makes them really mad, makes people want to dismiss global warming. Then this demand side has been addressed by supplying contrarian ideas from climate deniers. So you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So now we get to the environmental beauty burden paradox. And here we see Kimberly Ruffin, who popularized the notion. Yeah, Harris, in her book about eco-feminism, addresses a different kind of environmental paradox. And she brings up one that talks about Black women's relationship with the earth. So I'm going to read a quote as it appears on the next slide, I believe. Yes. So, as has been mentioned, Black women have a paradoxical relationship with the earth. In the words of Kimberly K. Ruffin, who is seen on the page right here, in the slide, this paradox involves recognizing both the history of beauty and burden in African American environmental history. So Ruffin's conceptual framework sheds light on the connection between racial and environmental injustice more clearly by pointing to African American environmental experiences or earth stories that simultaneously reflect both the beauty of nature, such as that which is found by the poetry of Black literary artist Alice Walker, who we'll look at later, and also the theological reflections of Howard Thurman, as well as the horrors of the lynching tree and other forms of racial violence in which the earth or aspects of nature become complicit in a system of white supremacy. Does anybody have any questions or comments to that? Because I know that's a lot of information, and any questions at all? Does anyone want to ask? You can put in the chat. You can private message, you can raise your hand. Okay, good. And if you have questions, keep them coming in the chat. I love questions, it's incredible. So now that we learned more about the beauty burden paradox, we're gonna look at one of Alice Walker's poems entitled Torture. So Alice Walker is an American novelist. She's the first African-American woman to receive the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. You might have heard of some of her other works like The Color Purple, also a very famous movie. But now we're going to read one of her poems. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Can I have a volunteer to read Torture by Alice Walker?
I can read that.
Awesome, thank you so much, Tova.
When you torture your mother, plant a tree. When they torture your father, plant a tree. When they torture your brother and your sister, plant a tree. When they assassinate your leaders and lovers, plant a tree. When they torture you, too bad to walk, plant a tree. When they begin to torture the trees and cut down the forest they have made, start another.
Thank you so much. I feel like we need some snaps, it's a poetry. I don't know what it's called when you read poetry, I forget, but that was incredible. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we definitely see some reflections of that beauty burden paradox. But what does anyone want to point out? And if you can go to the next slide, please. What is the beauty in this poem and what is the burden in this poem? And there are no right answers. Shane, yeah.
So the beauty in this poem is them planting the tree each time something bad happens to them, and like using it as a symbol of their, continued resilience, and also of like maybe a spiritual connection as well. But then the burden is seeing how it's also, as much as it's this great symbol of their resilience, it's also a symbol of what they've had to go through, and especially when it's used in a way to perpetuate these systems of oppression, that it can be harmful, but they still have to retain connection to it because it's like the only thing that they have power over in some cases.
That was beautifully said, and you even answered the third question, which is incredible. What is Alice Walker's overall message? What can it teach us? Thank you so much for sharing. We have time for one more person to share. You can also sorry.
No, I was going to say everything that Shane said. Also, I think like planting a tree is a great like visualization of a nonviolent protest in reaction to a very violent action, which I think is a really interesting and really important way to think about like reacting to that kind of intensity is with nonviolent protesting.
Yes, that is a very good point. Sorry, I cut you off. I was going to say you can feel free to write in the chat as well. But yeah, Yona, I didn't even think about that. That's a really good point. So yeah, as we go through the rest of this presentation, keep in mind these two terms, ecofeminism, eco-womanism, and this paradox that we see with Black women and nature. And we can also sometimes apply that to our own lives as Jews. So think about that for the rest of the presentation, and I'm happy to pass it to Lucy.
Thanks, Maya. So we talked briefly when we were talking about the start of eco-womanism that some sects of it are applicable to Indigenous womanhood, but we didn't really get into that, so now we are. So if we move to the next slide, first, just a bit of a preface is that a lot of our presentation is centered around ecofeminism and eco-womanism, like in our hemisphere. And evidently there's so many other movements of ecofeminism and eco-womanism that are prevalent on other continents. But right now we're going to speak specifically about Indigenous eco-womanism in North America. So a bit of a question for everyone, and again, if you want to write in the chat or just unmute, how might colonialism and the patriarchy go hand in hand? Why do they connect? What might be some examples of that? All right, that is okay. We can move on to the next slide. All right, so here is a quote about this. So colonial, oh, thank you, Asher. Asher, I think you accidentally direct messaged me, or maybe it's on purpose. But thanks for the participation. So yeah, so Julia wrote in the chat, Indigenous women, Indigenous civilizations were colonized. The colonizers enforced gender roles on these societies, yeah, like through residential schools. And Asher wrote, Indigenous women being murdered at higher rates. Yeah, so these are definitely very apt examples. Also, sorry, this is not actually a quote, but yeah, so other examples of, or just a broader definition of the link between colonialism and patriarchy. colonialism destroyed indigenous structures of government, kinship, sex and gender roles, and epistemologies, and imposed new systems of Western origin, which a lot of folks noted in the chat. Elena is really hinting on this larger theme within ecofeminism, that the same systems used to oppress people of non-male genders are similar to the hierarchies used to suppress the earth. And so now we can move to the next slide and see how resistance, eco-feminist and eco-womanist resistance is used. So land back, which you might have heard of, is a movement that fights to return the land that was stolen from Indigenous people back into Indigenous lands. And in an interview with women from the Land Back organization, Amy Smoke, the co-organizer of the Waterloo Land Back movement, said that colonialism doesn't like women to be leaders. So again, there's that repetitive theme of like these oppressive hierarchies, like they're all the same. And especially in communities that are matrilineal, this is like very opposed to kind of cultural values. And there is a link in the chat to the land back movements if you're interested in learning more about them. And again, one of the core tenets of colonialism is patriarchy. And that is applicable in many forms of, or many cultures, not just within the patriarchy that we live in individually, but again, like it's replicable, it's active in different spaces. And we have, in addition to the element of centering men, there's centering of heterosexual men, and then a centering of the adult as a head that is a small part of the population that controls and has power over everybody else. And in addition to looking at the land back movement, our policy working group is also developing a toolkit about Stop Line 3, which is another movement of Indigenous sovereignty that definitely does a fantastic job at centering female voices in the common justice world. And again, check that link out in the chat.
Yeah, so with climate change, not only are communal structures and cultures in danger, like the indigenous population in North America, but the direct safety of women and girls is threatened. And a lot of the time, this danger is influenced by stereotypes, which Lucy will talk more about. Stereotypical roles held by women are perpetrated through natural disasters in harmful ways. Women in Bangladesh typically avoid emergency shelters during floods and other natural disasters because, as Godland Albert of the Gender Equality Network Women for Climate Justice states, it's not appropriate to stand there face to face with men or to use the same toilet. That's why most women prefer to barricade themselves in huts where they're often simply washed away by the floods. Here, the stereotypes are internalized, and Madeline, you can go a few slides forward. Yeah. These stereotypes are internalized by the women, and they inspire self-inflicted harm. Also, across the world, child marriage is used as a quote-unquote survival strategy. It's seen as the girl's monetary purpose because the marriage provides a dowry for the families. The dowry is typically a few cows, which is quite valuable for people in Kenya and other African countries. In fact, it's how many families generate an income, by prostituting and selling off their daughters. For example, Natoya Sande was forcefully married at 13 years old when she was younger than most of us here. In an article from Deutschmark Well, Sande states, I was sent to be married because of a shortage of food in the house. Her parents once had a small piece of land, but Noah's Ark-type floods caused by the accelerating rate of natural disasters caused by global warming wiped out their harvest. I tried to negotiate to tell my parents that I wasn't ready, that I didn't want to get married, but they told me that I had to because that would mean one mouth less at the table. The DW article, the Deutschmark Well article, defines a phenomenon called sex for fish. As supply of fish becomes limited in African countries such as Kenya, fishermen are demanding sex in exchange. Dr. Cheryl Broverman, a professor and researcher of global health at Duke University, studies the correlation between environmental harm, poverty, education gaps, and the HIV epidemic for girls in rural Kenya. In one of her TED Talks, she explains, when things go bad, the first crop you harvest is the girls. In order to put food on the table, to enter the market economy, to receive an education, these girls must sacrifice their health and their humanity. And this is caused by poverty, caused by natural disasters, caused by global warming. All these crises are connected, and their root is always the climate crisis. And I can paste all those links in the chat for you.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Also, someone sent in the chat info about an activist from Uganda, Vanessa Nakate, and that looks really interesting. I'll check her work out. So now we're going to move on again to a broader scale of ecofeminism, and that is emotional stereotypes. So we can move on to the next slide. So on this slide, there's an art piece by an activist, organizer, and artist, Fabiana Rodriguez, who does a lot of work centering ecofeminism. And I would definitely note that this is more of like a positive portrayal than the emotional stereotypes that we're going to talk about. But I think that's the power of eco-womanism and ecofeminism, like the duality of it, of how it can be perceived as like a negative or positive thing in the conflation of womanhood with quote unquote nature or the environment. And so the questions that I would urge you to think about, and again, like feel free to write this in the chat or speak out loud. How are women frequently portrayed, Jewish women, and how does this relate to the relationship between humans and the earth? Like, how do you think folks' perception of women is conflated with the earth, and what does that mean? I think for me, something that I note within the second question specifically is obviously, I think within a lot of our religious lives, like we're very focused on the lives of Jewish women, but generally within like these larger texts, Jewish women are generally like silenced or neglected. Their stories are kind of off to the sidelines. And when we think of like biblical characters, we don't often think of them, or maybe a handful in comparison to like all these other men in the Bible. And there's this positive notion that Penelope noted of like Mother Earth, protective, caretaker. And something that I think is really interesting about this feminine language for the earth is that when we inflict things like climate change upon the earth, and we're saying that this is how we treat Mother Earth, what does that say about how we treat women within everyday life, within institutions? And there's this notion of women being docile, and this has similar themes within like how we treat the earth. Like we can inflict all this harm on the earth and it doesn't matter because this nature is docile. And I would argue that climate organizing, and specifically in spheres of ecofeminism, is a direct response to that claim, saying like, no, we will not be docile to this existential crisis. Like we're taking action, and women as well as the earth won't be complicit to their own mistreatment.
So in my eyes, one such woman that fits the description that Lucy offered of a climate organizer, or just an organizer in general, that rebels against the system and doesn't put up with its binaries and with its regulations that usually pander to the superior group. That character that I think of is Lilith. And she's not a character from the Tanakh. She's actually a Midrashic character present during creation. And a Midrash, if you don't know, it's essentially biblical fan fiction. Whenever there's a discrepancy or gap in the Tanakh, the rabbis of the past, all men of course, would attempt to make sense of it with Midrash, a writing that interprets the discrepancy or gap and potentially remedies it. One example is the story of Avraham smashing the idols in his father's shop. This was actually not original biblical text, as many people would assume. It was a liturgical addendum to the biblical text. In creation, there seems to be a similar discrepancy worthy of this midrashing magic. So in chapter 1, The first man and woman are fashioned simultaneously from the earth, its soil and roots. In chapter 2, in contrast, the first man is created and then the first woman is fashioned from his rib. So how do we reconcile this? How do we make sense of this difference in facts, basically? In the alphabet of Ben Sira, a Midrash is offered in which the character of Lilith is introduced. Adam and Lilith were originally created at the same time, both from the earth. But when Lilith misbehaved and refused to be dominated by Adam, both in a sexual and social sense, claiming her equal status, she was cursed by God and vilified by the text. She morphs into this baby-killing demoness, which is a particularly unfavorable portrayal because during that day and age, women's only responsibility, as ordained by Jewish society, was to reproduce and create life, and here Lilith was actively destroying it. In Lilith's place arrives the ever-obedient, compliant Eve, who unhesitantly adheres to Adam's every command and whim. Now, this text is from 9th century Babylonia. We have made much feminist progress since then, and therefore, I think so too should Lilith's story. In the 70s, in the midst of second wave feminism, there was a prominent Jewish feminist author named Judith Plaskow, and she wrote a revised Midrash about Lilith called The Coming of Lilith. So if you can go to the next slide, Madeline. And this version tells Lilith's story in a much more empowering and contemporary light. And so for the next 10 minutes or so, we are going to be reading The Coming of Lilith by Judith Plaskow. I believe there is a Jewish Women's Archive link in the chat. And then we will have a brief discussion about it and what it's bringing up for us in the 21st century, not the 20th. So do we have any volunteers to read the first paragraph? And maybe we can screen share the text also so it's easier for people. Yeah. You're breaking up a little, but do you want to try to go for it, Abigail?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So in the beginning, the Lord God formed Adam and Lilith from the dust of the ground and breathed into their nostrils the breath of life. Created from the same source, both having been formed from the ground, they were equal in all ways. Adam, being a man, didn't like this situation, and he looked for ways to change it. He said, "I'll have my figs now, Lilith," ordering her to wait on him, and he tried to leave her the daily tasks of life in the garden. But Lilith wasn't the one to take any nonsense. She picked herself up, uttered God's holy name, and flew away. "Well now, Lord," complained Adam, "that uppity woman you sent me has gone and deserted me." The Lord, inclined to be sympathetic, sent his messengers after Lilith, telling her to shape up and return to Adam or face dire punishment. She, however, preferring anything to living with Adam, decided to stay where she was. And so God, after more careful consideration this time, caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and out of one of his ribs created for him a second companion, Eve.
Okay, another volunteer?
I can read.
Go ahead.
So the second paragraph. For a time, even Adam had a good thing going. Adam was happy now, and Eve, though she occasionally sensed capacities within herself that remained undeveloped, was basically satisfied with the role of Adam's wife and helper. The only thing that really disturbed her was the excluding closeness of the relationship between Adam and God. Adam and God just seemed to have more in common, both being men, and Adam came to identify with God more and more. After a while, that made God a bit uncomfortable too, and he started going over in his mind whether he may not have made a mistake letting Adam talk him into banishing Lilith and creating Eve, seeing the power that it gave Adam.
Any other volunteers?
I can go.
Sure.
Meanwhile, Lilith, all alone, attempted from time to time to rejoin the human community in the garden. After her first fruitless attempt to breach its walls, Adam worked hard to build them stronger, even getting Eve to help him. He told her fearsome stories of the demon Lilith, who threatens women in childbirth and steals children from their cradles in the middle of the night. The second time Lilith came, she stormed the garden's main gate, and a great battle ensued between her and Adam, in which she was finally defeated. This time, however, before Lilith got away, Eve got a glimpse of her and saw she was a woman, just like herself.
After this encounter, seeds of curiosity and doubt began to grow in Eve's mind. Was Lilith indeed just another woman? Adam had said she was a demon, another woman. The very idea attracted Eve. She had never seen another creature like herself before, and how beautiful and strong Lilith looked. How bravely she had fought. Slowly, Eve began to think about the limits of her own life within the garden.
One day, after many months of strange and disturbing thoughts, Eve, wandering around the edges of the garden, noticed a young apple tree she and Adam had planted, and saw that one of its branches stretched over the garden wall. Spontaneously, she tried to climb it, and struggling to the top, swung herself over the wall. She did not wander long on the other side before she met the one she had come to find, for Lilith was waiting. At first sight of her, Eve remembered the tales of Adam and was frightened, but Lilith understood and greeted her kindly. "Who are you?" they asked each other. "What is your story?" And they sat and spoke together of the past and then of the future. They talked for many hours, not once, but many times. They taught each other many things, and told each other stories, and laughed together and cried over and over, till the bond of sisterhood grew between them. Meanwhile, back in the garden, Adam was puzzled by Eve's comings and goings, and disturbed by what he sensed to be her new attitude toward him. He talked to God about it, and God, having his own problems with Adam in a somewhat broader perspective, was able to help out a little. But he was confused too. Something had failed to go according to plan. As in the days of Abraham, he needed counsel from his children. "I am who I am," thought God, "but I must become who I will become." And God and Adam were expectant and afraid the day Eve and Lilith returned to the garden, bursting with possibilities, ready to rebuild it together. So this is a Midrash that I think takes what was written in the alphabet of Ben Sira and flips it on its head in the best way possible. It illustrates Lilith basically doing the same actions as she did before. She is still rebelling against Adam. She is still claiming her equal status, but the reaction is different now. She's not an evil monster. She's a hero. She's the hero of her own story. And also there's this relationship with Eve and Lilith that is formed that is almost a sisterly bond that empowers the both of them as opposed to drawing them apart. And then, meanwhile, there's a relationship between Adam and God that is fractured, it's precarious, there's an obvious power imbalance. And even God seems to be quite unsure and unable to make the right decision. And that has its own qualms since God is God. But the point is that the relationship between Eve and Lilith is so strong because they are willing to truly see each other for who they are, as opposed to trying to prove their macho manliness and be better than. And I want to invite all of you, if we go back to the slideshow, to answer a few questions in discussion. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I think we can get something started here in terms of ideas and sharing them. So the first question is, how does Plaskow's Lilith differ from Ben Sira's? How did your perception of her change from source to source? Does anyone want to start the ball rolling?
I mean, I think that Plaskow's interpretation definitely has a more positive spin on Lilith. And there's no incorporation of the sisterhood between Lilith and Eve and Ben Sira's interpretation, which I think is really telling of the kind of very strong notion of solidarity within the second wave that Plaskow wrote this in.
Yes, definitely. And there's that contrast I mentioned in that it's the perception of Lilith that is changing. It's not Lilith's character from source to source. She's the same person, she's the same woman, but it's our frame of mind that is being altered when we read about her in a new light, in a light that isn't portraying her as a dissonant in society or a disobedient wife who refuses to adhere to her husband. We're looking at her as an independent woman who has her own hopes and dreams and who wants to make her own relationships as opposed to being forced into them. And I suppose that leads us into our second question, which is, what might Plaskow have been thinking about when writing this Midrash, and what was happening in the feminist movement at the time? So this was the 70s, mid-70s about, and it was in the midst of second wave feminism. Does anybody know about that historical period and want to interpret how it might have affected Plaskow's thinking? Yeah, Shane.
Yeah, so I know second wave feminism was really like the main wave of feminism around in like the 70s, 60s, 70s, maybe early 80s, like the centered around different ideas, like really they were the ones who began with the idea of like equal pay for equal work between men and women. They women's liberation and Gloria Steinem, that sort of movement also had to do with second wave feminism, and really like whereas first wave feminism back like in the earlier 1900s had been really stressing just giving women the right to vote. Second wave feminism was calling for equality on all fronts, in the workplace, in the home, to be considered able to perform the same duties as men. And so this reinterpretation, I think, in the context of that, I noticed it's not like all it's really asking that Lilith was asking for in this version is to be considered equal from equal to Adam. It's not like there's any, it's not that much crazy to ask that like to be considered equal, and that's and yet that required some level of like radicality to it in order to be achieved, and that's in real life, like they weren't asking for that much. They were asking to be considered, equal in the workplace, in the home, and that's not to say that that's changed at all, but they were just asking for equality, and they faced so much like pushback and resistance from the patriarchal world that they had to develop some level of radicality. And I think this reinterpretation of the story shows that, with just like asking to be treated equal to Adam, but facing this pushback, being forced to leave the garden, and having to live outside the garden and take on this role and being seen in this light. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I think what you're saying proves that feminism wasn't dead then, and it still isn't dead now. When we gained the right to vote, we thought, oh, perhaps, now women have all the status that they need. But half a century later, and we were still asking for the most basic fundamental right, equality. And we were perceived as radicals. We were perceived as those arguing against the system and attempting to upheave it. And indeed we were, because that system was not benefiting us and was not viewing us as equal. And that's exactly what Plaskow is getting at here with Lilith. At the time in the 70s, these Stepford wives were growing really restless, and they wanted to express themselves in ways that didn't involve cleaning, cooking, in general being in the kitchen and in the home. And they placed that focus primarily on the workplace and being able to engage in meaningful work. And I think that is illustrated in the Midrash when it says he tried to leave her the daily tasks of life in the garden, but Lilith wasn't one to take any nonsense. Adam and Lilith were born as equals. They were made of the same earthly material, but Adam immediately had a superiority complex. It was almost like the patriarchy was ingrained in him as soon as he was birthed. And so he tried to dominate over Lilith, but she wouldn't put up with that. She wanted her independence, and she wanted her ability to pursue creative work that didn't rely on him. So thank you so much for your comments, Shane. And I think the last question we can consider before we move on is, how is this Midrash lacking? It was written in the 70s. It was written and considered radical at the time, but it's not the 70s anymore. It's the 21st century. It's 2022. How is this version of Lilith's story still lacking modern elements, and how can it be remedied?
Something that sticks out to me is the ending of the Coming of Lilith. And I guess this alteration, I think, would be more of a continuation of the story. But my favorite part is when they say God and Adam were expectant and afraid the day Eve and Lilith returned to the garden, bursting with possibilities, ready to rebuild it together. I think it would be really beautiful to see what that looks like, to see that kind of revolutionary spirit transforming the Garden of Eden, and what those possibilities become.
Definitely, and I think it would be interesting to see that sort of organizing on the climate activism and climate justice level. During this time period, there was a shift to equality, but that shift was equality to a certain group of people. It was specifically to white women, to eco-feminism, as we were talking about, not eco-womanism. It didn't include minority women. And they wanted equality in two respects, therefore. They wanted equality on the basis of sex and on the basis of race. And they weren't receiving that within the feminist movement that existed at the time. And so that definitely influenced Plaskow's writings, maybe not in particular this Midrash, but definitely in her other books. And so it's important to recognize that as she was writing this modern Midrash, she wasn't necessarily thinking about every type of woman. She was thinking about her version of womankind. And I think that can also benefit us when we're thinking about climate organizing and eco-womanism. How do we engage those that are most affected, those that are on the front lines, that are experiencing the natural disasters and that need our immediate help? And those can, most of the time, be minority women. So now we're going to, with all of this in mind, transition to a visioning activity led by Lucy.
All right, so evidently today we've talked about a lot of big and heavy stuff. So now we're gonna do a visioning activity sort of as a debrief. So I'd invite you all to grab like a notebook, a piece of paper, like loose cardboard, whatever you have around that you wanna use, and any implements you'd like to write or draw. And again, this is very low key. I don't think we'll have time to share out. So whatever works for you. And just turn your camera on when you're ready, if you can. And Madeline, if you could share the word cloud, and if not, I can. So our first question is going to touch on the words that you put in for the word cloud and reflecting on those after you've learned all of this, or the discussions you've had, like connecting that to what you've gleaned from today. So we'll take a little bit to write and reflect on that. And feel free to also reflect on what you see other people writing about on the Mentimeter. All right. So now I invite you all to write or draw about how will you apply this presentation to your organizing, whether it be in climate spheres or otherwise. And it can be on a broad level or like individual actions you plan on taking. And how can you also apply this information to your everyday life aside from organizing? All right, so evidently we have limited time, so I'm gonna throw out the last prompt because it's my favorite one. And no worries if you don't have any time to write or draw about it. So combining the last two responses you wrote or drew, I'd like you all to think of a future in which the demands of eco-womanism are met. And what does that feel like to you, look like to you, smell like? Who's in your community? What do you do? Where and how do you find affinity? How does it feel different from your current life? Better, different, just all those things. Just take a little bit of time to reflect on that.
So as you're finishing that up, if you're comfortable, you can write a few sentences in the chat about what you envisioned. I would love to read them, to hear them. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us and for doing that visioning activity. Before we close up, I want to talk about some next steps that you can take in order to support eco-womanism. So Madeline, if you don't mind going back to the presentation, that would be great. Yeah, just to the next steps. Yes, that's perfect. So when you're facilitating programs like this, or lobbying or protesting, doing any type of climate justice work, you should identify and address the intersections between sexism and climate change. So prioritizing women of color, acknowledging the disproportionate effect that climate change has on women, specifically women of color. You should also check out the Green Belt Movement's website, which someone please put in the chat. And they work to promote environmental conservation. They work to build climate resilience and empower communities, especially women and girls. That's my alarm. And they also work to foster democratic space and sustainable livelihoods. They have a place to make donations if you can, that would be incredible, or just sharing the website. Yeah. Lastly, perhaps inspired by the Lilith Midrash discussion, you can write your own modern Midrash about another biblical woman. Isn't that so exciting? I'm definitely going to do that instead of doing my homework. Esther or Vashti's stories might be interesting to reflect on, especially because Purim was last week. So yeah, I'm so happy that you all came. Thank you so much. We had so much fun learning about Jewish climate feminism with you. We hope you had fun with us. And make sure to join tomorrow's session on anti-Semitism and the climate crisis. It's at the same time, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much.
That was incredible. You guys are amazing. I am blown away. I love this presentation. I hope you're so proud of yourselves, and thank you so much for making this.
Thank you for encouraging us to do it.
Yes, thank you so much. This was fun.
See you tomorrow night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.